You know, like many of us, Lou was introduced to model railroading in the early 1950s when his father brought home a Lionel train set for Christmas. In the 1970s, he started construction of his HO scale Boston and Maine West Hoosick division. That endeavor was featured many times in the pages of Model Railroader, the Great Model Railroads, and on Alan Keller's Great Model Railroad video number 23. In the late 1970s, Lou started writing articles and drawing cartoons for the Model Railroad magazine. In the early 80s, he was invited to do layout shoots around the country. He and his wife, Cheryl, continue to do photo shoots for Kumbach's Model Railroad publications to this very day. In early 2008, he dismantled the West Hoosick division, moved south, and started designing and building his 1930s era ON30 Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad. He and Cheryl have had numerous articles featuring the layout in the Model Railroader, and the layout has been featured in Model Railroad Planning and the Great Model Railroads. In 2017, Lou was invited to join the Model Railroad staff as a contributing editor. So with that, let me introduce Lou Sassi. Lou, take it away.
Thank you, Peter. I guess without further ado, we might as well get right into that keynote presentation. We're going to do a little, we're going to do a tour of the railroad on our rail bus. But before we do, we're going to talk a little bit about how we built the railroad. And as Peter mentioned earlier, our railroad is an ON30 layout. It's of the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes, and it's based on the real Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad, which was one of 5 2-foot gauge railroads that existed in the state of Maine in the late 19th to the early 20th century. The Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes was the largest of these, and it covered more than 110 miles and operated more than a dozen 40 steam locomotives. After graduating from college in 1964, I picked up Linwood Moody's book, The Maine Two-Footers, and I got hooked on the Sandy River. Then in 1968, shortly after my wife Cheryl and I got married, we made one of our first road trips to South Carver and rode on the Edaville Railroad. The Edaville was 5 miles long, and it was built by Ellis Atwood to help work the bogs on his cranberry farm in eastern Massachusetts. He managed to purchase 4 40 engines from the scrappers in the early 1940s. 2 were from the Monson Railroad and 2 were from the Bridgeton and Harrison. He also saved a number of freight and passenger cars from various abandoned 2-footers, including the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes. Even though I was enamored with the Maine 2-footers, the lack of equipment in any scale in the 60s and 70s made it very difficult to model in 2-foot gauge. Since standard gauge HO was much easier to deal with, I started building a 30 by 25 foot HO West Hoosick division, as Peter mentioned, in the basement of our upstate New York home in 1978. Then in 2008, while working on my book, How to Build and Detail Model Railroad Scenes, my friend Tony Parisi from Tony's Train Exchange sent me a Bachmann ON30 Forney. And the ON30 is replicating the Maine 2-footers, 2-foot gauge, but it actually runs on HO track. It's 30-inch. So it runs on HO track. So after running that locomotive on my HO railroad, I was so impressed with the operation of the engine, I asked Jeff Wilson, one of the editors at Kumbach, if I could include the construction of an ON30 diorama on the last 3 chapters of this book. And here we see the chapters. Chapter 6 was on bench work, track, and wiring. Chapter 7 was adding scenery to the module. And Chapter 8 described how I created a photographic backdrop for the module. The bench work on the module consisted of 2 Woodland Scenics 18-inch by 3-foot modules. They come in kit form, and here we have of them bolted together. When I also added 2 by 2-inch horizontal cross members 2 feet long to increase the width from 18 inches to 2 feet. Here we have the original diorama. It's 6 feet long by 2 feet wide. It's 2 of the Woodland Scenics modules bolted together. And you can see the first layer, the track work is built on two 2-inch layers of styrofoam. The lower layer is the blue insulating styrofoam. It's a very dense styrofoam, and you can pick that up at Lowe's. And here we see the diorama under construction with the first layer styrofoam added. And here we see the completed diorama in upstate New York before our move south. That's the Strong Station on the right-hand side and the Forster's Toothpick Mill on the left. In 2009, we sold our house in New York and moved to North Carolina. At that same time, I decided to get out of HO and using the diorama as a starting point to build a larger ON30 railroad in the bonus room of our new home. So from 2009 to 2015, I worked on the railroad using the salvage benchwork from the HO layout to replicate the Woodland Scenics module construction. Photos in the description of the construction can be seen in Tony Cosper's 2015 model railroad planning. And here we have the chapters discussing the construction. On the right-hand side, you can see me explaining the original module, or expanding on the original module. The original module is this in front of me in that photograph. And here we have a track plan of the entire Sandy River and Ramsey Lakes as it exists. 7 feet wide by 20 feet long, and it's a closed loop. Here we have the Kingfield side of the layout. This will end up being summertime. It's under construction. Now we can see both laminates of the 2-inch thick blue styrofoam on the bottom. That's the dense home insulation styrofoam. And on the top is a 2-inch layer of white styrofoam. It's a less dense with more air voids. It's a lighter weight styrofoam. And here we're laying out the track using Woodland Scenics foam panels and risers as a basis for the ground and the track work. Here I'm rasping the foam with a Woodland Scenics rasp, and I'm sucking up the excess foam with a vacuum cleaner. Gets a little messy if you don't. I fill the voids and the contours with lightweight spackle, DAP Fast and Final, or you can use Woodland Scenics foam putty. And here I'm laying out the home bed, marking it with a pencil, and I'll cut that off and glue that to the Woodland Scenics risers. And here we see the construction on the Kingfield side. It's proceeding. I've painted some of the styrofoam, and we've got the track laid. And here we are a little bit further along. On the north end of the layout, I cut out a section of the top layer of styrofoam only, and I added a base of 1/8 inch hardened masonite, and this would be the base for the winter mill pond. So let's discuss the structures on the railroad. Most of the buildings on the layout were scratch built. Oh, here, I just had a note here. Most of the buildings on the layout were scratch built by my good friend, Rich Cobb. I've had Rich build the basic structures from photos and drawings I supplied, and then I weather them and add details to suit my needs. Now we're looking at the Kingfield side of the railroad again, and we're on the right side of the entry door. And it's Kingfield, it's midsummer. If we step to the left of the entry door, we see Strong. Strong is early winter. Upon entering, we see the Mountain View House. Mountain View House was made from 2 Bar Mills, Idaho hotels. It was kit bashed by Rich Cobb And I was kit bashed because I saw this building, or a replica of this building, on a layout owned by Tom Staten in upstate New York. He has since torn the layout down and sold all the buildings. As we move to the left, we see the homes in Strong. The one nearest the camera, in the lower right, is a model of the actual house behind Strong Station on the prototype. And here we see the actual house on the left of this photo. It still exists in Strong. The railroad's all gone, but that house still stands there. The last time we were up there checking things out, it had a for sale sign out front. Here we see Strong Station and the freight house. The station is a Banta Models kit, while the freight house was scratch built by Rich. Here we see the prototype, the actual station and freight house. This is the photograph was taken in the 1930s. And here we have a model of Strong Station, the model on the lower right, and the station itself in the upper left. And here we have the model versus the real freight house, the model being at on the right-hand side, and the freight house in the upper left. And you'll notice on the lower left, for a short time, I found this quite interesting. I found this photograph in one of Jerry DeVos's hard copy books on the Sandy River. It became a luncheonette for a short time. They turned it 90 degrees, had it face Main Street and Strong, and made it a luncheonette, but that's since disappeared also. Here we have Forrester's toothpick mill again, and you'll notice on the right is the original building that was on the module, but then as I increased the size of the layout, I had Rich build me an addition to the building, and that's on the left. The left, it's actually in the center of the photograph. Here we have a model versus the prototype photo, the prototype in the upper left, the model in the lower right. And that again, scratch built. This behind the Forrester's Mill is Fenster's Farm Fresh Produce. That's just a stock bar mills kit. And that's one of the buildings I managed to purchase from Tom Staten when he tore his layout down. To the left of all this, we see the H.G. Winter and Sons Mill, and that's a scratch built module of the real mill, H.G. Winter and Sons Mill. That's actually quite a large building. It's 2 feet long by about 1 foot wide with an addition. And here we see another view from the pond side of the mill. And here's a shot of the model on the left and the prototype on the right, upper and lower right. This was in Kingfield. As we go around the pond, cross over the pond, we come into Kingfield and we see on the right-hand side the Kingfield Wood Turning Company, which was actually in Strong on the prototype, but since I didn't have enough room in Strong, I decided to place it in Kingfield. It's scratch built by Rich Cobb. Here we have a front view of the same structures. The models on the lower right and the prototype in the upper left. Here we have a scratch built model of the Kingfield engine house. The engine house was actually a car shop in Kingfield. There's a kind of a good story about this. It was a car shop for many years in Kingfield. But in the early days of the railroad, I just found this out in one of Jerry's books also. In the early days of the railroad, it actually was the engine house. I thought it looked a great deal like an engine house when I saw it, and lo and behold, it actually was in its early days. Over time, it was moved to a different location. It was moved over to the left, away from when they installed a turntable. It was moved over and used as a car shop, and it was replaced by a 3-stall roundhouse. And it still is the only building still standing in Kingfield. It's still there. It has an addition, but it's still in the same location it was in when the railroad existed. Here we see Kingfield Coal Shed. It's freelance and scratch built by Rich. And here we have Main Street in Kingfield. And from the left, we have a scratch built post office. Then we have the Bar Mills Gravely building. This is a building I just built, one of the last buildings I built for the railroad. I just did that last year and installed that. And that's a stock Bar Mills kit. And beyond that is Phil's Over the Hill General Store. That was a kit bashed, or I'm sorry, that was scratch built. And the Kingfield Post Office is actually a model of the Strong Post Office, but again, I decided to place it in Kingfield. Here we have Peerless Tanning Company. This is also a scratch-built structure. The real building was not on the Sandy River. It was in Johnstown, New York. I placed it here and I built it originally. We'll see some more pictures on it coming up. But I built it because Cheryl and I drove by it every day on our way to and from work at GE. It sat midway between Johnstown and Gloversville, New York. And here we see a few pictures. One on the upper left is of the prototype building. And I made models or had models scratch built of this building, different models for different dioramas in HO. The one in the upper center is actually a very close rendition of it. And I still have that module and that building in my possession. I really liked it so much I hung on to it, even though it's HO scale. The upper right and lower right are of another building I had built. John Birchnell owns this now. I gave this to John. He has it up in Cincinnati. And then in the lower left is the model that's on the EO 130 railroad we have right now. Here we see Kingfield Station. This again was scratch built. And here we see the model on the lower right, and we see the prototype on the upper left in Kingfield. Here we see the National Auto Parts store, and this was scratch built. And the reason I had this scratch built was my father managed a National Auto store for 35 years in Saratoga Springs. But the real building, the building this is modeled after, exists now. It exists in Colonial Williamsburg. While Cheryl and I were visiting Colonial Williamsburg, we bought a book on the structures in that museum. And in that book, I found these two pictures on the left. And the one on the top, at one time, that building was actually an auto parts store. So that's why I decided to make it a national auto parts store. So I replicated that. You can see that on the right-hand side. And I added enough, I added some features to it to make it replicate, look similar to the one in Colonial Williamsburg. Here we have Aunt Carrie's Diner. This was scratch built by Tom Staten. Excuse me. And here we have Kylie's Texaco station, which is a stock bar mills kit. Again, it was built by Tom Staten. Here we see Clark's Furniture Refinishing. This was scratch built by Rich, and it was weathered and repurposed by me. It was originally going to be a railroad storage building on my South Strong module, which was recently featured in an article in Model Railroader, I think earlier in 2022. Across the street, we have Elwell's Bar. This was scratch built by Frank Baker from photos of an HO scale Foscale kit that was on Dick Elwell's layout. Here we see Winter's Dry Goods store in Kingfield, and this is a selectively compressed model of the prototype that still exists in Kingfield. This was scratch built by Rich. And here we have the prototype versus the model. The prototype, you can see, is substantially longer, and the model on the lower right is a bit shorter to fit on the layout. Here we have another view from a different angle of the same two buildings. Jebediah's Carriage and Wheel Works is a stock bar mills kit, and that came from Tom Staten's layout. And the company arborist comes on board. One very hot and humid summer day about 6 years ago, Cheryl asked if she could help out with the layout. I suggested after some discussion that she try her hand at making trees. And wouldn't you know that her first attempt ended up being an MR article on making hardwood trees. That is actually her first hardwood tree that she made in O scale for the railroad. Now, since white birch trees were a dominant species in Maine and the primary reason for the existence of the Sandian River and Range City Lakes, I asked her to try her hand at making a white birch. And this resulted in another article in MR. And you can see the tree in the photograph. One of her latest creations in the subject of an upcoming article that is yet unpublished is a white pine tree. She's been making a number of them, and this happens to be her first white pine behind the station in Strong. And here we have the White Pine Grove. This is just to the right of the Mountain View House as you walk in the door to the train room. She also tried her hand at making winter oaks, and she uses raw untreated peppergrass, which holds some of its tan-colored dried up dead leaves, and it very closely matches the look of oak trees in the winter that tend to do the same thing. Here's some of her swamp grass, which is made using a mix of commercial and wild materials, and this article is actually published in the latest MR. And here she's got some field grass that she created using the same techniques of mixing commercial and wild materials. You can see her white birch tree in the left foreground, one of her first white birch trees. She also tackled a stump right in front of Kingfield Station. She made this using a piece of a stick of wood, and she blended it in with some roots that she made from artists' tube acrylics. The pine grove to the right of the Mountain View House features some ferns and actually has a fallen log with mushrooms growing out of it. She surprised me with that scene one day, and I was very impressed. One of her favorite trees is we see in the right here. This is number 10 crossing the Winter Mill Pond. On the far right, we see a hardwood tree close to the embankment with its exposed roots showing. This was recently featured in a two-part article in MR back in 2022. I've often had people ask me about my power lines. They've been impressed with them. I add a lot of detail to them. And the reason they are that well detailed is because of this young man right here. Dick, unfortunately, passed away in October, but before that, we were friends for over 45 years. I met him in 1978, and when I first visited his HO scale Hoosick Valley Railroad at that time, even at that time, it featured finely detailed power and telephone lines. And there was a reason for this. Dick worked as a lineman for New England Telephone for over 40 years, so he knew his stuff. With his guidance, I started adding poles and lines to my HO layout, and I included the techniques he and I used in my 2014 Basic Scenery Second Edition how-to book. And here we see chapter 18, although with the article in it, although out of print, these books are still available on eBay. And here we have some various pages from the article showing diagrams on the left and photographs on the right of the Peerless Tanning Company diorama I still have. Here's another shot of Peerless Tanning Company. You can see the pole lines running along the streets. And we have another shot of the Peerless module. And lastly, we have the Mountain View House on the present layout. And I want to mention that if you were interested in trying this technique, details needed for creating these lines are available from various suppliers in both HO and O scale. So with all of that, why don't we, let's take a ride on the Sandy River. We're going to grab a seat on our rail bus, pulled up in front of the Mountain View House, and the station hack has some additional riders, and its driver has brought over, driver has brought over from Kingfield. Here our rail bus crosses Adams Street and is on its way to into Strong. Heather Forster talks with a neighborhood boy by the tree swing in her family's front yard. We're going to pass Strong Freight House as we enter the village of Strong. And now we're pulling in front of Strong Station, and we see a few locals waiting to greet passengers and others to depart And that's Superintendent Oris Vos standing in front of his track car, looking on at the action. Here we're looking down the alleyway between the two Forester Mill buildings, and we spot the rail bus passing in front of the Fenster's Whole Food produce and fruit stand. A mill worker looks on as our bus passes over the rail crossing between Forester's Mill on the right and the massive Winter Mill on the left. Our bus is rolling through the dense woods just north of the Winter Mill. And here we cross the trestle over the Winter Mill Pond as a local fisherman pulls his rowboat up onto shore. Another view of us rolling across the trestle, that's Kingfield Engine House in the left distance. Entering Kingfield with the engine house on the right and Kingfield Wood Turning Mill on the left. We enter Kingfield from the north with the rail car shed on the left and a tank car temporarily spotted at the coaling facility on the right. The excess rails, ties, and wheel sets in the foreground are from scrapping operations on the Kingfield extension to Bigelow. We're entering Kingfield Yard, and that's the standard gauge, or as the Sandy River boys like to call it, the wide gauge interchange track in the foreground. Our brakeman throws the switch as we pull up to Kingfield Station. Once again, you can see the wide gauge track in the foreground. Our rail bus crosses West Street in Kingfield with Elwell's Bar on the left and Clark's Furniture Refinishing on the right. We pass Elwell's Bar on the left and Kylie's gas station on the right. And we pull back up to our starting point by the Mountain View House to drop off our passengers. Hope you enjoyed your ride. And finally, some detailing projects. I imagine people look at this and they wonder, just what are you going to do? The layout's just about finished. Well, there's always something to do. So here's a few projects that I've been working on. One of them is I bought 2 Diffco milk trucks from Kevin McComber a couple of years ago, and I rebuilt and weathered them because I've always liked the 30s Art Deco style of these Diffco trucks. And they actually worked. They started to be built in the 30s. The first Diffco trucks were from the 30s, and they never really changed their look. Here, I have improved my Bachman pulpwood cars by replacing the plastic framing and loads with real wood. And this is an upcoming article in Model Railroader. And here again, I used some discarded trucks and scraps of wiring and truss rods and whatnot to replicate the remains of cars burned after the abandonment of various sections of the Sandy River over the years. And this is another article that should be coming up in the magazine. Here I added tractor loads to a couple flat cars. The tractors are Ukrainian models of 1930s American prototypes. This is another article. And since many of the photos of the real Sandy River locomotives show them with plows attached, since it snows much of the year up there, I've recently been scratch building plows for a few of the engines on our railroad. So I hope you've enjoyed our tour of the Sandy River Railroad. This presentation encourages you to undertake some projects that will enhance the realism of your own railroads. Before I take any questions, if there are any, I want to thank Peter Smith for inviting me to take part in tonight's program. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Lou. That was just fantastic. I had the good fortune of seeing Lou's layout in person during the Hickory Convention, and I was simply blown away by how realistic it looks. It's the most photogenic layout I've probably ever seen. You can point a camera almost anywhere, and the picture is perfect. We do have a few questions, Lou. Let's see, we start off here. Bruce Bowie wanted to know, how did you use the mini power lines? Any tips? And I suspect, as I'm wondering, what you're using for the power lines themselves.
For the wiring?
I would guess that's what you're after, yeah.
Yeah. It's very complicated stuff. It's very expensive. It's shoe thread. You can buy it, you can buy it at Michael's, or if you can find a shoe store anywhere, you can buy it at a shoe store, or you can, like everything else in life, you can always go to eBay.
Yeah.
It's the telephone line, they call that open line when you see that green thread. That's it was cable in the cities. They wrapped them all together and they made it into a cable in in urban areas, but out country and in small towns like that, I use green button thread for the telephone lines, and then I use a leather or a heavier duty leather thread for the power lines, the upper lines of the power. The telephone was always on the lower part of the pole. They were 8 to 9 feet apart. Power was always on the upper part of the pole.
You really look exceptional. Jerry Cornwell says the Cheryl's trees are exceptional. Chuck Proudfoot, HON3 to everyone. That's his logo. Where is the rear truck? Where is the rear truck? Oh, he says found it. Okay.
Rear truck.
I don't know what he meant by that. Bruce Bowie, what are you using for the very realistic headlights on your motor car?
That's actually a Bachmann car. That's just stock.
Stock stuff, huh? Okay.
That's stock stuff. Well, actually, it's not stock. There's an article coming up on that too. That was actually it's a Bachmann rail truck, and I kit bashed it into a rail bus. But there's an article on it. But the whole forward section of that bus is the rail truck. I just built the body of the bus.
Got it. Bill had this to say. I had a chance to see the layout on the way back to RDU after the recent Hickory convention. One thing that really deserves mention is how this center backdrop was done to make the photography easy. And that is interesting because everywhere you look, almost the backdrop takes care of is in the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, I made the backdrop freestanding. It's not attached to the layout. And there's a void between the layout. If you recall the diagram, there's approximately a foot in there. It's 20 feet long, 7 feet wide, but in the center it's a foot void in there, and you can shift the backdrop one way or the other. I actually right now I've been leaving it centered in that void, but it gives you a little distance between that and the foreground, so it gives you kind of an illusion of distance.
Steve Hollenbuck says, well done. Mark Lewis, thoroughly enjoyed the visit to your layout, Lou. John, Lou, please keep going with your ON30. You are an inspiration to all of us, Maine narrow gaugers. Seth Newman says, open wire. Not sure what that means.
Well, open wire is the telephone lines. There's
Okay.
two types there's two ways to approach telephone lines. There's open wire and there's cable. And as I said before, when you get into an urban area, when you get into cities, towns and cities, they would bundle the wire together and put it in a cable rather than having multiple open wires for each phone. They would wrap them into cables. So it's cable and open wire. That article covers all of that. It's a very good article. Dick, I worked with Dick on that. And as I said before, even though the magazine is long out of print, you can go on eBay and you can find them all over the place.
Okay. Robin Peel says, beautiful. Seth Newman, open wire is the name of the telephone lines on the insulators. Is that correct? Yep, I guess it is. And that's it. Thank you very much, Lou. That was really a fine presentation, and your modeling work is just exquisite.